Okay, great. Hello, folks. Thanks everyone for taking the time and participating in the first one of our seminar series for the semester. We're very excited to have Lukas Nord talking about his market paper today. Thanks to our awesome panelists for taking the time and attendees for attending. It's going to be a great talk. Allow me for a second just to show you some information about our seminar series before we get started with the talk. Okay, doing it properly. So again, today we're going to have Lukas talking about shopping, demand composition, equilibrium prices. We're going to have our usual format of 1 hour for the presentation and 15 minutes of Q&A. And of course, if folks wanted to keep having a discussion, that's going to be great. Worst case, I stop the recording and we keep chatting economics. This is our first of the 4 seminars we're going to host for the fall semester. On October 16th, we're going to have Bruno Bi. Later in November, we're going to have Michael Cho, and we're going to finish in December with Olivier Wang. Stay tuned. We're going to send more information. And of course, again, one more time, I would like to thank our amazing team of panelists for participating and taking the time and offering their comments. So with these simple words of housekeeping, Lukas, the floor is yours. Please share the screen and let's do this.
Okay, I hope you can see my screen and you can hear and see me clearly. Thanks a lot for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here today and talk about what was my job market paper last winter, and it's called Shopping, Demand Composition, and Equilibrium Prices. Before I start, I should say that anything I'm saying today is not the view of the Fed and also not the view of the company that provided the data for this project. So where I start from here is the observation that households don't pay the same prices for their consumption bundles. And people have looked into that because it's differences in the prices that households pay are important to understand if we want to interpret inequality in resources or in the amounts that households spend in terms of inequality in consumption and ultimately in terms of inequality in utility and welfare. What's been shown so far is that the prices that households pay differ on at least 2 dimensions. The first is that there's substantial dispersion in posted prices for identical products. And when I say identical products, I mean something kind of as disaggregated as a single can of Coke. So for this can of Coke, at any given point in time, there's going to be substantially different prices across different stores, and households differ in how much they exploit these differences in prices for identical items. In particular, if you look along the expenditure distribution, you will see that households at the bottom of the expenditure distribution make more trips to stores conditional on purchasing the same number of items, and they end up paying about 2% less for exactly the same item, for exactly the same kind of Coke, as compared to households in the top quintile of the expenditure distribution. So the first differences in prices is differences in prices paid for exactly the same item. The other difference is that households at different points of the expenditure distribution also buy different consumption baskets. Again, if you compare the bottom quintile to the top quintile of spending, what you get is that at the barcode level, so at the level of a can of Coke versus a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi, at that level, you get an overlap in consumption baskets between the first and the fifth quintile of spending that is only roughly 60%. Okay, if they would buy exactly the same products, this should be 100%. It is only 60%. And the differences in households' consumption baskets are systematic. If you compare kind of the products within close substitutes, so say within fresh apples or within fresh oranges, that households at the bottom and the top of the distribution buy, you find that among close substitutes, the households who spend less buy products that are on average roughly 7% cheaper. Okay, so there's systematic differences in the consumption baskets of households. Now, everything that I said so far is talking about differences in the prices that households pay, more or less taking these prices or the posted prices as given. However, these posted prices are equilibrium objects, and they should in part respond to the behavior of these households in the goods market, and that's what this paper is going to be about. What I'm going to study here is how posted prices interact with inequality across households. In particular, I'm going to think about how household heterogeneity affects posted retail prices, what consequences this has for the distinction between consumption and expenditure inequality that I started with, and also what implications this can have for the response of retail prices to aggregate shocks to the economy. Before I go into the details, let me give you the intuition of this paper in one slide.
So Lukas, just before you go there, just a couple of questions in terms of the shopping effort, right? And in terms of how that can interact also with the distribution of prices and consumers across space, right? Because one of the reasons why, for example, high-income households would potentially pay more for the same item is that in order to find the item at a lower price tag, they need to commute much further away from their household, right? It's like, I remember this when I lived in São Paulo as an undergrad, and pizza in some neighborhoods were way, way cheaper, but there was no way they would deliver to like my apartment because I had to live downtown because that's where my brother had his apartment. Right. So in that sense, like even though I would have the same shopping effort, that wouldn't allow me, or the cost would be significantly higher to reach those prices. And that can be an equilibrium object, right? But that kind of creates this discussion of like local prices and how much market power firms have in different areas, right?
So if kind of this would be the main driving force between the dispersion and prices that we see in the data, then what you should get is that store fixed effects explain a lot of price differences, right? So there should be some stores that are always expensive for all items and some stores that are always cheap for all items. And actually some work, so the paper that I've been citing here by Greg Kaplan and Guido Mencio, what they have shown is that of this overall price dispersion, store fixed effects explain very little. What explains most of this price dispersion is temporal variation within the same store. So something is going on sale today, but it's more expensive again tomorrow. And differences in relative prices across stores. So there's one store that's always cheap on Coke and expensive on Pepsi, and one store that's cheap on Pepsi but expensive on Coke. So for both cases, kind of you can think of shopping effort is I have to go more frequently to the same store to make use of these sales, or I have to kind of visit more stores and split my bundle, buy the Coke here and the Pepsi over there to kind of arbitrage these price differences. Okay, but it seems to be, at least in the data, less of a story of kind of store and location fixed effects, and more these driving forces like relative prices within the store and variation over time in prices for the same item in the same store. But thanks for that. It's good to clarify that. So let me give you the key mechanism of the paper in one slide. Okay, this is the intuition I would like you to take away from this. Start from these two observations: households with high and low expenditure, they don't buy the same basket of products, and they pay different prices for exactly the same product because they differ in their shopping effort. They differ in how many visits to stores they make to purchase the same number of items. Now, let's think about these two facts through the lens of a retailer who is posting prices for these households in equilibrium. Okay. Heterogeneity in households' consumption basket means that demand composition is going to be different across products. There are some products that I'm selling to the low-spending households. There are some products that I'm selling to the high-spending households. Differences in households' shopping effort, from the retailer's perspective, are just differences in the price elasticity of demand. If I'm searching very carefully for cheap prices, visiting multiple stores, I'm more likely to find cheaper competitors and substitute away towards them. Okay. If I put these two things together, what you get is that in equilibrium, the price elasticity of demand is going to change with the composition of demand, and retailers should post lower prices by reducing their markups if they're selling products to search-intense households. Okay. That's going to be the mechanism that will be at the heart of this paper. And I think there's a question.
Yeah, so just a quick question. So for the Menzium, Guido, and Kaplan, their papers before the pandemic, right? After pandemic, you can see there are way more delivery and everything. And basically, all supermarkets now offer this kind of online shopping. I mean, it doesn't have to be online shopping, but basically you can have the goods and stuff delivered and you don't have to physically go to the stores. So I wonder when you say shopping efforts, I mean, it depends on your data, right? Is it before or after pandemic? Because then the effort will be very different connected to the result, right?
The data that I'm using here, I stop right before the pandemic. So kind of think of this paper as talking about before the pandemic. But even with this online shopping, you would still have to be willing to, it's not enough that there's one retail store to which you go that now has an online delivery option and you don't have to physically go to the store to kind of get this shopping. in there online, what you would have to do is visit multiple retailers' websites, right? You go to the website of Walmart, you go to the website of Whole Foods, you go to the website of Trader Joe's, you order some things here, you order some things there. And that's kind of the online equivalent of the shopping mechanism. Okay, so I don't have data on the post-pandemic period. I think it would be very interesting, but kind of just the fact that you can get stuff delivered at home is not necessarily making a difference here. You would still have to kind of compare different websites, which might be easier or might be, given how complicated the websites are, might be more costly than just walking into the store and checking the price.
Right. I mean, that's one thing. And the other thing is the subscription, because we actually use that. So when you subscribe to a certain, like, it's like you become a loyal customer, right? And they give you some kind of a discount, and basically it's reducing search costs, and also you kind of enjoy some kind of a bargain. But this is like I don't know how large the fat is, honestly, but I mean, just notice this changes.
I think it would be super interesting to understand, but like the data that I have is pre-pandemic and kind of actual retail stores. There's no online retailing, Okay, so what am I going to do? What I'm going to do in this paper, I'm going to develop an equilibrium theory of expenditure inequality and price dispersion that can account for all of these patterns in the data that I've talked about before, and that can reproduce this mechanism that I've described intuitively on the previous slide. This model, in short, is going to have heterogeneous households on one side. They are ex post heterogeneous due to incomplete markets and exogenous income risk. These households are going to have non-homothetic preferences to get differences in their consumption baskets, and they're going to have an endogenous decision of how much they want to search for cheap prices, how much shopping effort they want to exert. On the other side of the market, they're going to be retailers, and these retailers endogenously post price distribution, one for each of the different varieties in the economy. Together, these features allow me to match at the same time data moments on price dispersion, differences in prices for exactly the same item and across items for households at different points of the distribution, and differences in these households' consumption baskets. The key findings of the paper are going to be that first, this theory allows me to formalize this mechanism for which I gave you the intuition before and test it in reduced form against the data. I'm probably not going to spend too much time talking about that today. A lot of that is in the paper. I'm happy to chat about that later on. What I'm going to talk about today is kind of revisiting this contribution that shopping has, differences in prices paid, for the distinction between consumption and expenditure inequality. And I'm going to show you that the fact that households differ in how much they search for prices overall reduces consumption inequality by roughly 5%. And half of this is due to an equilibrium effect that comes out of retailers posting lower prices for households who search more to reduce the prices paid for any given good. And then in the end, I'm going to think a little bit about kind of how this has implications for the response of the economy to aggregate shocks. In particular, I'm going to show that kind of the response of retail prices to aggregate shocks will crucially depend on the distributive effect of the shocks, so which households in the economy are going to be hit. Because if you hit the poor or the rich households with an aggregate shock, then you're going to change the composition of demand, you change the average price elasticity in the economy, and that will affect whether retailers want to increase or decrease their profit margins, whether they want to increase or decrease prices. Similar things hold when you want to think about kind of the government redistributing income through a tax change. Again, you'll have to think very carefully how this changes the composition of demand, because that affects the price elasticity and that affects the optimal prices that retailers want to post. That for an overview. Then
so Lukas, just very, very, very quickly. So there are two aspects here. One is that the rich people spend more for the same product. The other one, they buy more expensive varieties. And in a sense, these two can be almost orthogonal. And I guess I would like to emphasize as you go in which dimension they are orthogonal, or if there's an interaction between these two aspects, which so far is not clear yet.
This entire paper is about the interaction between these two aspects. So the story here is going to be, you search more than me for the same product. Okay, so you pay a lower price given we're buying the same product. But then, if you buy a different product from me and you search more, the average price for the product that you buy responds to your search effort. Okay, so basically the whole point of this paper is the fact that differences in shopping effort don't just explain differences in prices paid for the same item. They can also account for some of the price differences across items. They can explain why some apples are cheaper than other apples, because the buyers of the cheaper apples on average search more. Okay, I think that's going to be clear once I walk through the theory. So let me jump right into the model. And let me start by describing the household problem. So the household problem here can be split into two stages. The first stage is a very standard expenditure savings problem, given some initial assets, given idiosyncratic income risk. Think of households in an Iagari kind of economy. The only difference here is that instead of having utility from consumption here, I'm having an indirect utility function, the utility of expenditure. And this utility of expenditure is an endogenous object, and it's determined in a second stage. In this second stage, given an amount of expenditure, households decide on an allocation of consumption across different varieties and on how much shopping effort they want to exert to find cheap prices. The overall consumption bundle, so households derive utility from a consumption bundle, and they derive disutility from exerting shopping effort. And this disutility is going to be increasing in the size of your consumption bundle, basically to capture the fact that, if you want the same price reduction for more products, then you'll have to search more often. It's going to be more costly to search for cheap prices. The overall consumption bundle is going to be a composite between a grocery good and an outside good. And the grocery good is where the interesting part of the model is going to be. And I'm kind of making this distinction because I will use data on a household's grocery purchases. So basically, I'm going to calibrate the share of this grocery good to the size of the data that I have relative to the overall economy, just to kind of give you the intuition for that. Now, the grocery good itself is going to be a composite of different varieties. Okay, you should think of this as different varieties of very close substitutes. Think, for example, of apples of different qualities. Okay, so J indice, like the J index, basically describes low quality apples versus medium quality apples versus high quality apples. And households have non-homothetic preferences over these different types of apples. This is a non-homothetic CES aggregator. Intuitively, what this gives you is that as you increase the size of your consumption bundle, you want to have a larger share of that bundle in the higher quality apples, okay, in the apples that have a high QJ here, okay? So that is kind of on the differences, that is how the model generates differences in households' consumption baskets. And then there's a cost of search effort. There obviously has to be a benefit as well. And the benefit comes in a form of an effect on the prices that households pay for these grocery varieties. Because the prices that households pay for each of the grocery varieties are going to be a function of their shopping effort, a decreasing function of their shopping effort. And this function is an equilibrium object because it's going to depend on the price distributions that retailers post for each of these varieties. Okay, so this is how the price setting is going to interact with households' choices. On the other side of the
Lukas, just one clarifying question, and then the search effort is just a scalar. So your search effort is the same across the different varieties, right?
I'm making that assumption here, partially kind of for empirical reasons, because you can think of, if I'm visiting that extra store, if I'm going to the same store more often, I can technically kind of buy multiple varieties at the same time. So visiting 2 stores for one variety automatically means visiting 2 stores for 2 varieties. The other thing is a bit more technical reason. If you would allow this shopping effort to be different on the depending on the varieties, you would potentially get multiple equilibria or multiple solutions already at the household stage, because you have a complementarity between how much you shop for a certain product and how much you want to buy of that product. If I'm searching more for the low quality apple, that apple becomes relatively cheaper. I want to buy more of that apple, which means I want to search more for that apple. So kind of to avoid that, I'm making the assumption here that you have one search effort.
In some sense, there is the underlying assumption that like all the varieties are in the same stores. So when you're searching, so it's different from like if you're buying a car, then it's different, right? Because then like the place that sells one kind of car wouldn't sell another. But here you assume that once you went to the store, you can screen all the different prices.
Exactly. That is kind of the
Lukas, can I ask about the function PJ? I understand that's kind of shorthand right now for an equilibrium object that you're going to show us. But like somehow in the background, it also depends on everybody else's search effort, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me get to that. I'm going to spend some time on describing exactly that. Before I go into the search bit of the model, let me just give you an overview of kind of what the production side looks like. Okay. I'm going to take modeling the retail market here very carefully. On the other side, I'm going to be very stylized on production. Every variety is going to be produced with a linear production technology, which gives us kind of constant marginal cost for the retailers, so constant wholesale cost if you want. And households are going to have the ability to transform this outside good into grocery varieties, which is important because I'm going to use a Burdett-Judd framework, and you somehow have to kind of set the maximum willingness to pay, which is here determined by this outside option. The outside good I don't have data on, so I'm going to take the assumption that there are no frictions in the markets for this outside good. There's going to be one search market for each of the grocery varieties in the economy. I'm going to get on the next slide to the details on how this market works. And then at equilibrium, as I already mentioned, is kind of a fixed point between households' choices and the postal price distributions that come out of retailers' problem. And they interact exactly through this pricing function PJ, because that's going to depend on the one side on the distributions that retailers post. On the other side, it's going to govern especially the slope of this PJ with respect to search effort. That's going to govern how much households want to buy and how much households want to search for cheap prices. Now, how do these search markets look? So each of these markets for each of the varieties is going to be independent from each other. They all look exactly the same, except for different marginal cost and endogenous differences in who sorts into which market. So let me describe kind of how one of these markets works. I'm going to be building here on the framework of Burdett and Judd, in particular on a version of this framework by Christoph Pitka, which allows for household heterogeneity. Households in this market, and I'm going to index their choices here by their expenditure, because all the relevant choices, consumption and search effort, are determined in the second stage of the household problem, conditional on how much households spend. So households with expenditure level E is going to buy a quantity Cj of variety J. And the household is going to split this variety, this total quantity, into a continuum of independent purchases, okay? Think of, you want to buy 100 apples. For each of these apples, you have to go and search for a price. Price search for each of the apples is random. The household can either see 1 or 2 draws from the distribution of posted prices. Whenever the household sees 2 draws, he can buy from the cheaper one. Whenever the household only sees 1 draw, that's the only price the household can buy from. And whether the household or the likelihood of observing 2 prices at the same time, that is going to be determined directly by household's shopping effort. So I'm just going to assume that what the household chooses is the probability of observing 2 prices for any given purchase. Okay,
Lukas, perhaps you said before, sorry to jump in. Do we have a participation margin in these search markets, or you're assuming everybody participates and just the intensity of search is what varies?
The assumption is everyone participates, so everyone buys a little bit at least of each of the varieties. You know, if you're rich or poor, you're going to split your consumption differently in these markets on the intensive margin. Okay, so if you're poor, your consumption of the low quality variety is going to be relatively higher compared to your consumption of the high quality variety. So how these CJs change relative to each other, that changes with your spending, but they're always going to be positive. So you always consume a positive quantity of each of the varieties, and that means you always search for prices for each of the varieties. Okay, so
Lukas, sorry,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt. Like, given that there was a pause, right? This is not really my field, so please correct me if I'm saying something that. But like my understanding of the evidence of this thing was that, like, these things are not independent, right? Like, it would be like I do grocery at Publix. Has very good prices for fruits and vegetables. Okay, but then I end up buying everything at Publix. And then people who search more would go to Publix, buy the fruits and vegetables that are cheap at Publix, but then they will go to Walmart, buy something else that's cheaper Walmart, and maybe they're gonna go somewhere else to buy like a third. So like my price is like you are basically kind of like doing each of one independently. Like I'm doing this search one by one. Like, how do you think about this? Or what I'm saying is wrong? Like, because my understanding of the data is that this thing, what the search gives you is the ability to kind of split bundles. When you don't search too much, you just get one bundle, one place.
So
can I chip in on that? Because that's what I was thinking about. A lot of this buying seems to me driven by convenience as well. So sure, it depends on how much time you have in your hands, how much time you're going to be splitting your search, and how much you're going to just go to whatever the equivalent of Walmart in the UK would be, what, Aldi or something. So that's something that
no, but guys, this is what he said
how do you
before.
capture
This is Kaplan and Menzio say no.
So it is not the case that, you know, there are store fixed effects for the same product. you could think about, there's one store that sells all the high quality, high price products and one store that sells all the low quality, low price products. Okay. And so if you want, you can see the high quality bundle store and the low quality bundle store, and you can interpret these varieties as the high quality bundle and the low quality bundle, and you change between these bundles. There's also kind of, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of having kind of multi-product price posting in this model. The closest paper to that is another one by Greg and Guido together with Lena Rudanko and Nicolas Trachter, in which they kind of explain these relative price, there's differences in relative prices. So one store being cheap on Coke, one expensive on Pepsi, and another store the other way around. The problem is that to be able to solve that model, they have to allow retailers to post prices for the bundle, which is very well defined if you have kind of a consumer with homothetic preferences where everyone buys exactly the same bundle. In this economy, there's a continuum of different bundles, and that basically makes that model with retailers price posting for baskets of products impossible to solve, because the solution method that they apply doesn't work anymore if you have a continuum of bundles. So I think it's a very interesting problem to study, and I have some thoughts on how to maybe do that in the future. For now, that's simply not going to be here because I can't tell you how to solve that problem at this point, basically.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Now, this kind of tells you already kind of how this pricing function PJ is going to look like. This pricing function PJ is going to be the weighted average between the average posted price and the expected minimum of 2 draws. And the more likely you have 2 draws for any given purchase, the more weight you put on this expected minimum of 2 draws, which is lower than the average price. So this is kind of how you, on average, reduce the cost of consumption if you're exerting a higher shopping effort. Let me now briefly talk about kind of the retailers. So retailers operate in this one market. Okay, so a retailer is the combination of a price observation for one variety, and retailers have constant marginal cost for each sale that they make. Think of this as the wholesale cost of reshelving the product. Retailers also have some fixed costs, and there's going to be free entry. So the mass of entrance endogenously is going to make sure that kind of every retailer makes zero profits in equilibrium. Now, how do retailers decide on their prices? So retailers decide on their prices to maximize their profits, and their profits have 3 components here. So first, there's like a fixed cost, which is subtracted, and then retailers make a constant profit margin. So retailers post the price before they meet any buyer. Okay, any buyer who walks through the store can see the price and can buy at that price. So for every sale the retailer makes, there's a constant profit margin, which is the price minus the marginal cost. And then the number of sales that the retailer makes depends on the size of the market, total consumption of the variety relative to the number of active sellers, times the market share of someone who posts price P. That market share depends on the distribution of households in the economy, because you have to form expectations over which households you meet. That's kind of here, this weight, which just accounts for the share of different household types in total demand. And then given meeting a certain household type, you have to form expectations about how likely this household is only going to see your price, in which you're going to make a sale for sure as long as you post below the maximum willingness to pay, with probability 1 minus S. And with some probability S, this household is going to see a second price, in which case you only make a sale if your price is the lower of the 2 price observations. That probability depends on this endogenous object, which is the distribution of posted prices. Now, the nice thing about this model is what you can show is that despite there being very rich heterogeneity among households, what retailers care about from all of this distribution of households to set their prices is one equilibrium object, which is the demand-weighted average shopping effort S bar. Okay, so that is the crucial thing, and that is how everybody's prices is going to depend on the distribution of households out there, because that distribution is going to affect S bar, and that's what retailers are going to respond to. Kind of the way to solve this. So this is the standard Bode-Judd way. In equilibrium, retailers, are all identical for price dispersion to exist. They have to be indifferent between posting low and high prices. So they have to be indifferent between kind of a higher margin per sale and just a larger share of sales, because you're undercutting your competitors. The nice thing is you can get a closed form distribution for this equilibrium object Fj. And as I already said, the sufficient statistic to incorporate all of household heterogeneity for this distribution is this demand-weighted search effort, S bar.
Sorry, can I ask you just maybe a modified version of my previous question? So qualitatively, would it be the same? Would the same logic apply if I had high and low income? They just buy each a single J, but it's a different J. So they don't buy all Js.
The same mechanism would apply. So the fact that they have non-homothetic preferences and everyone buys a little of each good is important quantitatively because there's a 60% overlap. So you don't want to kind of split them perfectly. But the mechanism would apply, and it would be, in fact, quantitatively much stronger if the rich and the poor would be buying completely separated products, and the retailers could target their prices directly to who they're selling to. So here you can think you can think of this as more statistical discrimination, right? They're kind of targeting some average shopping effort, which might differ. Obviously, if for variety J, there's just positive mass on one type of household, then the shopping effort of that household, that would be the relevant shopping effort that the retailers kind of target their price setting to.
And just to make sure, you are assuming a form of commitment in the market you search in, because imagine you observe a very high price, I cannot switch ex post into buying a different variety.
Exactly.
I'm still going to buy the cheapest between those I observe within this market.
Yes. The way the protocol works is you decide I want to buy a low quality apple, then you go search for it. You see either one or two prices. These are the only prices you want to buy from, and you will buy from the cheapest one, conditional on that one being below some maximum willingness to pay. Okay. That is how it works. You can't change anything as possible.
And it's important is that you're, just to get it around my head, you are not allowing firms to, so each J is a different market of the firm, is independent. Otherwise,
exactly, each
profit condition will not work across markets, because then it will be
exactly this. This is where the assumption that a retailer is one price for one J. J is the market, you operate in that market, you can post one price in that one market.
So a clarifying question. So if a consumer wants to buy 10 units of the same J, this consumer will search independently for each unit.
Yes.
So, exactly. Okay. So this is abstracting away from the possibility that the seller use price and quantity to do some kind of nonlinear pricing. I cannot buy all my 10 units at the same store.
So it's a great question. The next iteration of this paper, which is hopefully going to come out in like 1 to 2 months, is going to have a version of Burdejat with an intensive margin. So where households kind of also decide how they split the quantity across this measure of purchases based on the prices that they pay. I don't have that here today, but I'm very happy to talk about kind of that extension after the talk. So that's going to be in there going forward. Okay, let me briefly talk about the mechanism. So I already told you that kind of the key object for retailers' price setting is this demand-weighted search effort S bar. Okay, so we take everybody's individual effort, the effort that I exert to reduce the price that I'm paying. We aggregate them with a share of different types of households in overall demand. That gives us this demand-weighted average search effort. That's what retailers were really responding to. They respond to kind of the average person who's buying their goods. And through S bar, my individual search effort is going to impose, in some sense, an externality on everybody else, because I search very little and I'm buying a lot of, say, I'm accounting for a lot of demand for, say, a can of Cokes, right? That everyone who buys a can of Coke gets a price posted based on my low search effort. Okay. The other interesting thing here to think about kind of how this S bar interacts with the composition of demand is to think about kind of what happens if you change the distribution of spending in the economy. Okay. Let me give you a very simple example. Let's say we live in an economy with just 2 households, Joey and Rachel, and the only product that they buy is pizza. Rachel is much richer than Joey. She can afford to buy 3 pizzas, and she doesn't search for prices for any of the pizzas. On the other hand, Joey just buys 1 pizza, and he searches very intensely. He makes sure he always gets 2 price observations before buying. Now, the demand-weighted search effort is going to be 0.25, which is just Joey's share in demand times his search effort, because Rachel doesn't search. Now, the interesting thing happens if you increase Joey's income so that Joey can have actually a higher level of expenditure. Okay? Joey is now going to do 2 things. He will now start to buy 2 pizzas instead of 1, and he's going to search less carefully for prices for any given pizza. What you get is that every individual search effort in this economy has either stayed constant for Rachel or it has gone down for Joey. Nevertheless, the demand-weighted average search effort has gone up. And that is because Joey now accounts for a relatively higher share of demand. He can now buy 2 pizzas, and that kind of attaches a higher weight to his relatively higher shopping effort. Okay. So what this model gives you is that you get kind of you break the link between everybody's individual search effort and how that responds to shocks, and how the average search effort in the economy responds to shocks, because you can have these shifts in the composition of demand. That's kind of what's accounting for the increase in the demand-weighted search effort. Okay, the last things I want to say about the model setup is that, you know, the nice thing about Burdett-Judd is you get a closed form solution for the price distribution, which means you get a closed form solution for the moments of this price distribution. What you can show is that the average posted price is indeed a decreasing function of the demand-weighted average search effort, and that is because the average profit margin kind of decreases if demand-weighted search effort goes up. If households become more price elastic, check prices more carefully, on average, retailers want to respond by posting prices with a lower markup. The second nice thing is that if you look at the third moment of the price distribution, the skewness, what you get is that the skewness maps 1-for-1 into the demand-weighted search effort. Why is that the case? Because if search effort goes up, you change the relative incentives between posting high and low prices, right? Because if search effort goes up, increasing your price will decrease your sales by more, right? Because households kind of are more likely to find the cheaper alternatives. Now, that means to keep retailers indifferent between low and high prices, what you need is the price distribution to adjust to have more mass among lower prices relative to high prices to get a longer right tail, which means to have a higher skewness. Okay, so in this way, kind of the third moment of the price distribution, the skewness very naturally picks up how in equilibrium the incentives of retailers of posting low versus high prices change, how they respond to search effort. And that's why I can use the skewness for an empirical test of whether this mechanism is there in the data. In the interest of time, I won't have time to kind of go over the empirical details, but basically kind of what I do is I use data from the Nielsen consumer panel, where you can get very granular observations on households' grocery purchases, prices, quantities at the barcode level. From this, in line with previous work, I can construct price distributions. I can compute the skewness of these distributions, and I can show that the skewness is indeed increasing in the share of demand coming from households who have a relatively higher search effort, in the share of demand coming from households with lower expenditure, lower income, more non-employed members, or older household members. Okay, so that's kind of as an empirical test, this link between the skewness and the demand-weighted search effort that is there in the data at the barcode, like at the very granular product level.
Very quickly, sorry, it's probably obvious. What is your measure of search effort in the data? Do you have like visits or like the number of stores they buy?
So I proxy for this S bar by kind of looking at the share of demand coming from households with different characteristics. And one direct measure that I'm using is the number of trips conditional on the number of purchases. And I kind of sort households based on that. That's one way. Then for robustness, I'm also doing this kind of splitting households along the expenditure distribution, along the income distribution, and conditional on whether the household has 0, 1, or 2 non-employed household members. So kind of like disposable time kind of story. No matter how you split it, kind of the skewness always goes in the direction that the households you would think have the higher search effort, like the skewness for the products that these households buy goes up.
Thank you.
So I have a question about this main mechanism. It seems that the average posted price is decreasing with the search effort, which means that because of the existence of poor households, the rich household can buy goods at a lower price now because of them. But I'm wondering whether there is another incentive, like the firm, because of the low household, they have an incentive to raise the price for the rich to try to like kind of recover their like profit.
That is going to be absolutely the case, because so I show you here the average posted price decreases in demand-weighted search effort, right? But if you look at this formula, kind of the demand-weighted search effort is going to be high if a large share of demand comes from the low-income households. But then the flip side is that, you know, if I go to the high quality apple that is bought by the rich households, a lot of weight is going to be attached to the low shopping effort of these rich households. So then the prices for them are going to be higher relative to a world where kind of everyone buys exactly the same consumption basket. So it's symmetric both ways.
Okay, but overall it's a decrease in the effort in the. So you have this too, like included in this like in this equation, but overall is it?
So it depends on the J, right?
Okay.
There's going to be one J which is bought by the poor households. There, the demand weighted search effort is going to be higher because you attach a high weight to the poor households who search a lot. Then there's one other J which is bought predominantly by the rich household. Their S bar is going to be lower because they get a lot of weight, they have a low search effort, and this is kind of how this cross product dimension is important here. Okay, let me briefly talk about the calibration and then spend some time on the quantification of exactly this mechanism.
Okay.
So
before you move on to the calibration, can I ask one more question about the models? Yeah. So do you ever consider the existence of long-term relationship between the retailers and the customers? Like if there is any commercial inertia? I'm asking that because you talked about the skewness increases in the high shopping households, but I think if you consider there's a long-term relationship, then there could also result in an increase in the inequality and skewness. And also that would also affect the firm's strategy of posting prices, because now prices can be used as a way to kind of lock in the consumers and build up their customer capital. So would there be any difference in the impacts?
So I think kind of your story would be more along the lines of kind of I can learn which store is cheap on certain goods, and I can always kind of go there, and I might want to have always a low price to attract certain customers, right? But then again, empirically, you should see store fixed effects playing a large role, because kind of if it's true in the data that a lot of the price differences are temporal, right? This store is cheap today because there's a sale, but tomorrow it's going to be more expensive again, and the other store is cheap because it's on sale. Then you always have to kind of repeatedly check where the sale is today. And the other thing is these relative price differences, which are very persistent, right? To exploit them across stores, to exploit that something is always cheap here and something is always cheap over there, you always have to visit these two stores. So you can't exert the shopping effort once today to find the cheapest price and then profit of that forever, because the cheap price that you find today will not be the cheap price tomorrow, or it's in different stores and you always have to visit the two different stores. So in that sense, I think kind of this long run effect of my shopping effort today on the price tomorrow, that I'm a bit skeptical whether it's there in the data, given how this price dispersion looks like.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
On that, just in order to match your model to the data, right? Because your model, retailers are at the product level, right? And you don't do any kind of aggregation. But if you did to actually match this result by Menzio and Kaplan, you're heavily relying on the multiplicity, right? In which for some goods, that particular store would be a low price and others a high price, and that would be evolving over time.
Prices are completely independent across markets. So you could justify with this model that the sorting is perfectly the opposite. So if I'm cheap in this market, I'm expensive in that market. You could also justify I'm cheap in this market, I'm cheap in the second market and third one. So that's
right. But it has kind of a folk theorem flavor of everything goes. Therefore, I can adjust.
I would kind of rather interpret this as single good retailers and not so much as a multi-good retailer posting completely independent prices across different markets. But I agree, I should do a more careful job in mapping this to the data. Right. Let me go to how I actually mapped things to the data here. So in the interest of time, I want to be brief. So the one thing, kind of the crucial object to discipline here are two. One is you have to discipline somehow the differences in search effort across households, and you have to discipline the differences in demand composition across products, okay, and who's buying what, because that's going to give you S bar for the low quality variety, S bar for the high quality variety. That's going to drive all of the quantitative results here. So what I'm going to do here is I discipline. So the differences in demand composition basically are generated by these non-homothetic preferences. I discipline these preferences by matching the overlap in households' consumption baskets conditional on price differences across products. Okay, that's kind of giving you differences in demand composition. How do I discipline the shopping effort? So the shopping effort is coming out of this disutility of search. There are two parameters to discipline: the level of the disutility, which is going to be kind of pinned down by the average retail markup in this economy, and the slope of the shopping effort across households. The slope of the disutility with respect to the size of your consumption bundle, that's going to be pinned down by differences in prices paid for exactly the same item. All of this is conditional on matching the right amount of price dispersion, which is important because the degree of price dispersion gives you the returns to search. Okay, so I want to pin down this disutility of search conditional on the right returns to search. Okay, so these are kind of the two cost-benefit trade-off at the household level, if you so want, which products to buy given price differences across products, how much to search given a return to search that I'm going to discipline here from the data. The moments I use, the model is able to match very well. The one thing I want to mention here is that the model is kind of able to generate the distribution of expenditures that I observe in the Nielsen data very carefully or very closely. And that has not been directly targeted. I target an income process and I target these preferences. The distribution of spending that comes out of that does look a lot like the data. So it's not that these preferences induce in any sort unrealistic spending behavior. The other thing is that if you kind of like take the empirical results of how the skewness co-moves with who's buying which product, and you run the same regression in the model is able to account for roughly 2/3 of the empirical differences in skewness across products, conditional on kind of having the same differences in demand composition that I have in the model relative to the data. So the model kind of does generate these patterns.
Question. Sorry, I'm cutting somebody. I'm sorry.
So quick question. So if I remember correctly, the Nielsen data doesn't have like Costco, right? I mean, for example.
Yes, I want to say. I mean, I don't know which stores they have, and I'm not allowed to investigate which exact store chains they have. But
yeah. I mean, the question is relevant because I think like, how would you consider things like Costco? Do you consider this a retailer or wholesale? And also, like, I don't know about. I mean, so it depends on different location. But say in Hawaii, this is like a majority of the shopping is made, like in terms of quantity, and we basically just compare several major things. But that's the example I was thinking about when and other people are asking the question, because you kind of pay the fee, but then the price wise is like a huge difference, especially when you buy a bundle. Yeah.
So I don't have a perfect equivalent to Costco in this model. I think you might want to think this is kind of exerting high shopping effort, paying the cost to getting a lower price. So in this model, Costco would be a retailer with a low price observation in a sense, but with a relatively high cost tied to exactly this price observation. So that's a bit kind of where I don't think there's a one-for-one mapping. Well, maybe we can discuss this after the talk, because I think I have like 10 minutes left, and I want to show you some of the results. Okay, so the first result I want to show you is.
I know you want to. Oh, I hope this is best. Like just to clarify, when you look at the data, I'm just thinking there are a lot of other things that correlate with income that also correlate with search. Like you have kids, you have one or like.
I take that out in the data. So in the data, I can show you that,
all that.
I run regressions for at the household level, kind of regressing an index of the prices that you pay for the same item on your spending, your income, the number of trips that you so your spending, your income, your age, the size of the household. So including both children and dependent and older dependents, basically. So like if you're caring for your mom. And in that regression, spending is placed like the size of your consumption bundle, if you so want, that plays a dominant role in explaining the differences in prices paid quantitatively. And that is why I'm kind of using this specification where the disutility of your shopping effort depends on the size of your consumption bundle, because even after conditioning on your number of children, your employment status, and your income, the level of spending is a big driver of explaining these differences, both in prices paid and the number of shopping trips that you make to get the same number of items.
Thanks.
Very quick update. You have 15 minutes starting now.
Okay, perfect. I have 15 minutes left. Great. Then I hope I get even to some of the aggregate implications. Let's see. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is about kind of how much does this response of retailers to who's buying from them and the differences in household shopping efforts, how much does this matter for the distinction between consumption and expenditure inequality? Okay, how much do households gain or lose because all the other households are searching very little or searching a lot for cheap prices? To do that, I'm going to decompose households' expenditures, and I'm going to do that in the same way in the model and in the data. Okay. Essentially, I'm going to split with a very complicated looking formula the price that you pay for any given apple into 3 steps. Okay. part of the price that you pay for a given apple is just the average price across all apples and all transactions, okay? That's this last term. That is basically the price you would be paying if every single apple, different types, different stores, have exactly the same price. Now, the price that you are paying for your specific apple differs from this price for two reasons. First, it differs because you're buying maybe an apple that is on average more or less expensive, a higher or lower quality apple, okay? That's the second term that's going to pick up price differences on average price differences across different varieties of apples. And the other reason why the price that you pay for your apple differs from this average price is that even conditional on the average price for your apple, you might be paying more or less because you might be buying it from a store that is relatively more expensive or relatively cheaper at the point in time when you're buying things, okay? To compute these price differences, first, I should have said, I'm sorting products into groups of close substitutes. So I'm comparing prices, like unit prices across apples, unit prices across oranges to make things comparable, okay? But again, the price that you pay for your apple has some average component and then differences in the prices across types of apples and differences in the prices for your given apple due to differences in shopping effort. How does this look in the model and the data? First, maybe the data on the right side. The way to interpret this graph is the first quintile of expenditures pays roughly 1.5% less because they're paying less for exactly the same apple, and they're paying roughly 4% below average because they're buying apples that are on average cheaper, okay? The model generates these patterns in the data quite well. It can account for the fact that overall, roughly 10% of differences in spending between the bottom and the top quintile of expenditure are actually accounted for by differences in prices paid for very close substitute, differences in prices paid for apple within apples, differences in prices paid within oranges, okay? To interpret this, kind of differences in the prices paid for the same item is a bit easier because, you know, you're getting exactly the same apple, you're getting it cheaper, that must be a good thing. Differences in prices paid across items are a bit harder to interpret because you're getting a cheaper apple, but that might also be an apple of lower quality. So, you know, you might value this apple differently relative to a higher quality apple. So to kind of make sense of these price differences across varieties, I think it's important to understand whether these price differences are driven by differences in marginal cost or differences in profit margins. Differences in marginal cost, there's nothing you can do about it, right? You want a high quality apple, it's more costly to produce this high quality apple. If you want that apple, you will have to pay a higher price. Differences in profit margins are just the cost of imperfect competition to households, right? You could, from an aggregate resource constraint perspective, get the same higher quality apple cheaper, but you can't because the retailer is able to kind of extract the profit margin from you. In this economy, there are two reasons for profit margins. Both of these, there are two types of differences in profit margins across households. And both of these kind of are determined by differences in shopping effort. The first is that differences in the prices paid for exactly the same apple, those are just pure differences in shopping and differences in profit margins for the same apple, and they arise from differences in individual shopping effort, okay? This is kind of the standard Aguiar-Hurst story about how shopping affects inequality. I'm searching more, then I'm getting a lower price for exactly the same item. But now in this model, there's a second equilibrium effect, right? Shopping is also going to affect the average profit margin, differences in the average profit margin across different types of apples. Why is that the case? Because the poor households who search a lot sort into the low quality apple. The rich households who search very little sort into the high quality apple. The average search effort is a different one across apples. And I showed you before, the lower the average search effort, the higher the profit margin that retailers want to post, which means you get a higher profit margin, a higher markup for this high quality apple, because collectively the rich search less and retailers kind of can discriminate based on the product that they're selling and target to the composition of their demand. All remaining price differences is then just going to be due to differences in marginal cost. I'm going to call that the cost of quality. Now, I don't have marginal costs in the data, but in the model, I can adjust my decomposition for this equilibrium effect, right? So the way to go from the left side to the right side is that I'm taking the black dashed line here, which are differences in average prices across products, and I'm splitting that into the two red lines here. And the red dashed line are the differences in prices across products that are due to different marginal cost. The red dotted line are differences in prices across products that are due to this equilibrium response of retailers to the demand-weighted shopping effort, to who's buying their goods and how much these households are searching. And you can see that this line is roughly as important as the black dotted line, which are differences in prices paid for exactly the same item, which is the direct effect of differences in individual search effort. Okay, so in this sense, kind of the equilibrium response of retailers to differences in households' shopping behavior doubles by how much these differences in shopping reduce consumption inequality relative to expenditure inequality. Okay, I'm saying consumption inequality relative to expenditure inequality, knowing full well that, you know, at the end of the day, there's a disutility attached to this differences in shopping effort. It just turns out that if you run counterfactuals in this model and kind of think about, you know, if I give you counterfactual prices as if, you know, everyone pays the same price for the same item to shut down differences in individual effort, everyone pays the same profit margin across items to shut down this equilibrium effect, what you get is that these price differences map more or less 1-for-1 in differences in consumption, because households don't change their consumption bundle that much in response to these counterfactuals. And they also roughly map 1-for-1 into differences in welfare, despite the presence of this disutility of shopping effort, because the level of the cost of the disutility cost is actually relatively flat along the distribution. And that is because while the poor search very intensely for cheap prices, they have a high S, the rich buy a larger bundle, so it's more costly for them to kind of get the same reduction in prices. They have a larger C. These two effects roughly cancel out along the distribution. Overall, what you get that the level of the disutility is very similar for poor versus rich households, and you can interpret these price differences 1-for-1 into differences in consumption and then differences in welfare across households. Okay, I think I have like 8 minutes left, so let me spend these last 8 minutes talking a little bit about the aggregate implications. Okay, so far this was all about kind of being very careful on the cross-section, understanding how different households differ in their shopping effort, how they differ in the prices that they pay, what the response of retailers across products implies for, you know, the distinction between consumption and expenditure inequality. I'm going to spend the last 8 minutes talking a little bit about kind of how this exact same mechanism affects how the economy responds to aggregate shocks. And essentially what this mechanism gives you is a new transmission channel for how aggregate shocks and policies affect the response of affect prices in the economy. Because if these shocks or policy redistribute income in any way, they will change the composition of demand. They will change whether products are bought by low or high income households. This change in the composition of demand will affect the demand-weighted shopping effort, and this effect on the demand-weighted shopping effort will then affect the prices that retailers want to post in equilibrium. Let me highlight how that plays out by talking a little bit about one specific aggregate shock, which is the Great Recession. Okay, so I'm going to take this model that's very carefully calibrated in steady state, and I'm going to hit it with a one-off, if you want, MIT shock that looks a lot like the Great Recession. This shock is constructed as a one-time unexpected loss of 15% of everybody's wealth to kind of proxy for decline in house prices during the Great Recession. And then earnings losses that are very carefully calibrated to how earnings changed at different points of the income distribution during the 2007 to 2010 period. Okay. When I'm going to look here, well, the object of interest is going to be a Lasper's index of aggregate prices. So you can think of like, I'm fixing the consumption bundle at the aggregate consumption bundle in steady state, and I'm showing you kind of how the average posted price or the average price paid changed during the shock. And what you get is that if you look first at the orange line, on impact of the shock, the prices that households pay fixing the consumption bundle in steady state are reduced by almost 0.7 percentage points. And that is the pure effect driven by shopping, because I'm keeping marginal cost constant throughout the exercise, okay? So these are just changes in household shopping behavior and retailers' response with their profit margins to changes in the shopping behavior. Prices paid decline by roughly 0.7 percentage points. Actually, 0.6 percentage points of this are driven entirely by changes in the posted price distributions, okay? So the blue line is how much do retailers respond to prices that they post. The difference between the blue and the orange line then arises because households also increase their individual shopping efforts. So for any given distribution of prices, they kind of pay a little bit more on the lower end. Overall, that is kind of the smaller effect on the prices that they pay. also here it's very important to account for this response of posted prices to changes in household shopping effort.
But to be precise, sorry, this is just composition. You called all the aggregates expand, like consumption fixed, right? I think it's just the composition between people.
I hold the way that I aggregate the average price posted and the average price paid across varieties. That I hold fixed because I'm aggregating across varieties with a constant consumption basket, which I take from the steady state. The demand-weighted shopping effort within each of these varieties can change because I allow households to change kind of their consumption behavior. It's just the way kind of, if you want to plot aggregate prices here, you have to take a stance on how you combine different varieties. And my stance is I'm fixing this in steady state so that you don't have the composition effect in kind of aggregating across varieties. Within each of the varieties, like every composition effect operates. And the composition effect is actually the last thing I want to talk about, and because that's kind of what's interesting here. So empirically, there seems to be some evidence using similar data, Nielsen or comparable, that retail prices respond relatively strongly to changes in house prices, but fairly acyclical to changes in local unemployment rates. And I can kind of like relive that through the lens of this model because my aggregate recession shock, or my great recession shock, has two components: a decline in wealth, which you can kind of think of as a proxy for a decline in house prices, and these earnings losses, which you can essentially in the Great Recession were heavily kind of skewed towards low-income households and were heavily driven by unemployment spells of these households. Now, if I look at these, so what I showed you before is both of these components together. I can look at the response of prices to each of these components in isolation. What you get is that the overall decline in posted retail prices is almost entirely driven by the decline in wealth. If I only switch on these earnings losses, so the decline in wealth alone would be the orange line. If I only switch on the earnings losses, then you get the yellow line. Okay, so think of this as an increase in unemployment. And what you see is that kind of, wealth explains almost all of it, and there seems to be a very weak response to the earnings losses. And that is despite these shocks being similar in terms of the net present value of lost income for the overall economy. Okay, so it's not that this is a tiny shock and this is a large shock. What explains for the difference in the response of prices is the composition of who is affected by these shocks. The decline in wealth hits households at the top of the distribution. These households now search more, which would increase demand-weighted search effort and reduce prices. And they also have to relatively reduce consumption compared to poorer households who are less affected by the shock. So there's a compositional shift towards households who have searched more to begin with. Both that and the increase in individual effort at the top drive average search effort up. Retailers want to reduce by cutting their profit margins by reducing prices. Now, if you look at the kind of earnings component, the two effects go in opposite directions. The earnings component is skewed towards poorer households. If they lose income, they individually search more. But at the same time, they also now have to reduce their consumption. They were households who searched a lot to begin with. Reducing their share in overall demand has kind of a negative effect on demand-weighted search effort. Overall, the average S-bar in this economy doesn't change that much, which means retailers don't want to respond much with their price setting, which is how kind of the same model, the same aggregates, like an aggregate shock of the same kind of size, but distributed differently along the distribution, can give you retail prices or profit margins in the retail sector that can go in opposite directions depending on whether you hit the bottom, the middle, or the top of the distribution. And with that, I think I'm out of time. So let me briefly conclude. What I do in this paper is I develop an equilibrium theory of expenditure inequality and price dispersion to think a little bit about how the distribution of households or household heterogeneity can affect posted retail prices. The one thing I would really like you to take away from this talk is that the composition of demand, the composition of buyers can matter a lot for posted retail prices. This has implications for the distinction between consumption and expenditure inequality. It has implications for the response of the economy to aggregate shocks. I didn't show you anything about policies, but you can get the same redistributive effects if I'm just kind of increasing a redistributive income tax or reducing it. Again, I'm redistributing income. This is going to have an effect on average retail prices. But let me stop here. Thanks a lot for being here and having me, and I'm happy to take any more questions that might be out there.
Excellent.
Lukas,
let's go ahead. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
So great paper. Just have a quick question on the last result. Maybe that's because I don't have all the elements of the model in mind. Do you have like Kaplan-Meier type of effects whereby the unemployed guy have more time on their hands and spend more time searching, or vice versa? I mean, the rich guy might find it more valuable to work harder rather than searching.
You have the same effect, but basically in the Kaplan-Meier JPE paper, where you have like this, this endogenous multiplicity between unemployed, like self-sustaining unemployment fluctuations. The difference here is that I have not two types of households, where if I increase unemployment, the change in demand composition is relatively clear. You just like you're making more people unemployed, right? Here it's a bit more kind of nuanced because you have this distribution of households. So I'm having the and I can show you actually. So basically what I can do is this is the response of posted prices, right? The response of posted prices is entirely driven by demand-weighted search effort. Okay. Demand-weighted search effort has three components: the distribution of households, their consumption policies, which together give you demand composition, and households' individual search effort. So I can say, okay, what would happen to S bar and posted prices if I only change the individual effort, if I only change the composition of demand? Look at the earnings component of the shock, right? In orange, you have what would happen if demand composition was fixed, but shopping effort changes. I'm hitting these poor households with a loss on their income. Individually, they want to search more. Individual search effort in this economy, keeping everything else constant, does go up. It's just that the shift in demand composition, because they adjust their consumption policies, goes in the opposite direction. So it's really kind of like it's not that the households here search less or don't change their shopping behavior. They do that. They do increase their shopping effort. It's just that you kind of change the weights that you attach to different types of households because their consumption changes also endogenously. And that's kind of what explains the difference to maybe the paper by Kaplan and Mencio.
Thank you.
So a very nice paper. So I think the assumption right now, we kind of shut down all the channels so that there's no way for the seller to do any kind of discrimination among the household given that for different income or expenditure level, because we now don't allow the quantity margin for price posting. We also don't have the multi-product aspect of price posting. But maybe some of these things could be interesting to maybe not in this version of the paper, but some of these things might be interesting. As we know, nonlinear pricing is not uncommon in grocery store. These things happen.
Basically, what I'm allowing here is price discrimination at the barcode level. Okay, so if you would say the can of Coke and the 6-pack of Coke, in the data they are different barcode, right? If the per unit price of one of these is higher, that would map into this product being kind of a higher quality variety here, right? So let's say the rich people always buy the can of Coke and the poor people buy the 6-pack of cans of Coke, okay? If the store knows who the average buyer of the single can of Coke versus the 6-pack is, right? That does explain why maybe the 6-pack on average is cheaper, because the store knows that the 6-pack is bought by the poorer households. Now, I do get that kind of the quality interpretation is not perfect there, because the single can versus the 6-pack, it's kind of a very similar product. You can't say it's a different quality. So then you would have to reinterpret this consumption aggregator a little bit more and kind of call it the poor households bundle and call it the rich households bundle. And J1 is the poor household bundle, J2 is the middle class bundle, and J3 is the rich household bundle, right? But then you could still get this effect of price discrimination across the single can versus the 6-pack, because the average buyer of the 6-pack is a bit more price sensitive, and that's why kind of the 6-pack is priced cheaper relatively to the can of Coke. But I agree, kind of it's a very abstract way of capturing that.
So there's some flavor. I agree. There's some flavor of it, not the traditional sense of price discrimination or screening.
I think it would be very interesting to think both about kind of the multi-product dimension for the retailer, and also more about this vertical differentiation and vertical sorting. So not like now, horizontal differentiation, horizontal sorting. But now I'm kind of saying, okay, low quality, high quality apples, right? But even by buying a can of Coke, the rich might buy the single can, the poor might buy the 6-pack, and there's some vertical differentiation there as well, which like the model right now is simple to pick that up. But I think it's an interesting margin for sure to
I'm just saying, I think the model is fine as it is. There are many potential ways to extend it because you have so many dimensions. You have the quantity margin you can explore, you have the vertical differentiation margin, you have the multi-product aspect of it. So 3 different ways the firm could have screened the agents.
But it's kind of like I think the key takeaway is like the mechanism works through statistical discrimination of who the average buyer for variety is. We just have to be kind of careful in what this variety is and how maybe, how we might want to sort and like how we might want to interpret these varieties in terms of the data. But yeah, again, I'm very happy to think about that going forward.
Just quickly follow up on that. I mean, not just the quantity bundle itself is interesting. Also, you can see some trade-off between, say, for example, the varieties offered by different stores regarding to the kind of pricing mechanism of quantity bundle. What I'm saying is here, you kind of assume like all the firms offering all the varieties or different things, right? Because the firm just enter and then you pretty much covers everything. I mean, I'm saying like somehow in Honolulu we have to interact with Costco a lot, but you see the thing is Costco offers a huge price bargain. So we have like a lot of discounts locally, even with the Costco compared to many other stores, and the price is way cheaper, but you cannot buy everything Costco. They basically offer like a mainstream kind of a products for say like a middle income households, but then for many other things, you have to go to different places, you have to do a little bit of search. But what I'm saying is if there's a cost attached to the variety being offered, which in this case is the discount you can receive from these mainstream bundles, then you see kind of the trade-off between the varieties and the price discount. So there's some interactions about that. I mean,
So in some sense, some of that is going on here, right? So I didn't show you too much about how households choose their consumption bundle, but these non-homothetic preferences, it's a non-homothetic CES. It works in a very similar way, kind of as a normal CES. So consumption shares across different varieties do depend on the relative prices of these varieties, which depend on my search effort and the distribution of prices out there. So the question of how much my search effort reduces the cost for each of the varieties. So in that sense, there's a little bit of that there, but obviously in a very kind of aggregated sense, because everyone always buys every bundle, then, relative prices across do affect the shares, but it's not that I'm kind of have any decision on the extensive margin of what to buy, just because also that would make it very kind of complicated to solve with multiple price distributions as who enters where, which varieties might enter the economy. But this CES aggregator in combination with the search effort gives you a little bit of that flavor because, again, consumption shares depend on relative prices, which depend on offered price distributions and search effort.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I think the model itself is doing a good job. I mean, in terms of what you're doing, the matching data and everything, it's already pretty complicated, honestly, to solve these different dimensions and heterogeneity. So it's good. Yeah, I like it a lot. Just another thing on a side note. So I guess I missed that. When we were talking about data briefly, did you explain the search effort? You mentioned something like how many stores visit, like what's the source of that data? Is it coming together with Nielsen or is it a separate source?
Yes. So let me go quickly here. So basically what I can do is I have this Nielsen consumer panel. I see at the barcode level kind of transactions, basically. I know you bought 1 can of Coke at this price at this store on this day. And then I know you bought a bottle of Pepsi in another store at this day. And then I can say, okay, you bought 2 items, a can of Coke and a Pepsi, and you visited 2 stores because I know where you bought it. And this is kind of how I can construct this measure of the number of trips, the number of stores visit, conditional on the items purchased directly from Nielsen, because the transaction data is kind of store, barcode, household, price, basically.
I see.
Can I ask a question about the data now that we're talking about it? I mean, when these price search models, many years ago were actually worked on, there was also this worry about consumer loyalty. So if you search, is to find the store. Now you found it. you have to search again, right? Unless there is something very different. And I wonder how much in your data you're seeing people repeating purchases of the same good in the same store, or at least similar goods in the same store. Because it seems to me that here we're always emphasizing this idea of people are searching to look for new prices, but once you get those, once you get that store in with a given price, say, I'm not entirely sure how we are mapping. So that is not happening in the model, with that potentially happening in the data.
Yeah. So I think kind of the way I would have to check the number and the data. I don't know, but I think it's a good thing to check. So the way you can interpret the shopping effort along 2 dimensions. And I think kind of the number of stores that you visit, conditional on the items that you buy, is a good proxy for both of these dimensions. The one dimension, so it all relates back again to what explains dispersion and prices in the data, right? If a lot of it is sales, it doesn't help you to find the cheap store today. You found the cheap store today, there's a sale, great. Tomorrow, there's not going to be the same sale in that same store. You have to check again where the kind of the sale for the same product is tomorrow, right? That is one part that explains price dispersion, where kind of loyalty and you find the one store and it's cheap there today, it doesn't help you to predict. There's actually a lot of turnover and kind of, so there's almost 99% chance that if you're kind of the cheapest store today, you will not be the cheapest store tomorrow, because you were on sale and you will not be on sale tomorrow, because sales are not that persistent. The other thing is this relative price dispersion. There, I agree with you. There you can learn, right? You can figure out that, the Coke is always cheap here and the Pepsi is always cheap over there. But then kind of you should interpret the shopping effort as the effort that you kind of are willing to split your bundle across different stores, right? And even though the Coke is always cheap here and the Pepsi is always cheap over there, every single time you want to get a price reduction on both products, you have to visit both of the stores. Because there's not this one store which is always cheap on everything. If that store would exist, then I agree. Once you find that, you're loyal to that store, you don't have to put any effort anymore. But that's really kind of not what explains a lot of this price dispersion in the data. So just by kind of going to finding one store and going there repeatedly, you will not be able to arbitrage kind of across these price differences, because that really requires you to always pay attention to where the sale is, or to always be willing to split your bundle in multiple stores.
But is it possible that at the store that you purchased last time, it's easier to search for their prices this time? So basically the search effort for them is lower for the outside other stores. So like
that I agree. And I mean, my hunch is that in the data, we do see a lot of people. I mean, I guess we all know how we do grocery shopping. So I think there's a high persistence in the stores that we do frequent. I think kind of the crucial question is, again, whether this relationship with one store gives you an edge in terms of, how easy it is to reduce your prices going forward. And for that, you would need a correlation between cheap prices in the future and having visited this store in the past, right? And that, as long as that is not there, because there's not this one store that is always cheap on everything, then I'm kind of less worried that there's some, we're always more, let's say you're always more attracted to the one store in your neighborhood, and then sometimes you visit some other stores, right? If that is the way you make purchases, you don't really profit of low prices in the systematic way of this one store, if that store is not just always cheap.
Lucas, that's why I was asking, I don't know that much with the Nielsen data set, but just like I said, if it includes those club stores or not, that seems to be make a very big difference. Why? Because the club stores, they usually on sale, but the thing is they have different products on sale in different time periods. And then if you combine that with the storage, that would be a very different thing, right? Because I may just choose to currently shopping my quantity for certain things to be really low, like zero, but I store that thing when the sales period is going to show up again, and that's totally predicted because you have the catalog. You can see the annual calendar. Right?
I agree. So kind of the other interesting extension of this kind of model is kind of how that interacts with storage, right? So the fact that
exactly.
You go to Costco, you buy it on sale, but then you buy it kind of in huge quantities, so that you can just wait. You just keep going to that same store and you just wait for the sale and then you buy it. I haven't done that extension, but I think it's an interesting story. I would have to again, Nielsen doesn't tell you the name of the retailers, so I would have to think carefully how to figure out whether Costco is in there and who's Costco, and I'm not sure whether that's kind of allowed by the data usage agreement. But I have to double check. But I think kind of the question of storage is definitely an interesting one.
Yeah, a question here. So Liang, I don't know what the other club stores are. I've only heard of Costco. So what are the other club
Sam's
stores?
Club, Costco, BJ. I can just give you a set. I mean, because here in Honolulu, somehow these stores are very, I would say, loyal customers.
I'm just curious. Are you a member in more than one of them? How many people do you think have
yes,
memberships
I do,
in more than one?
Yes, I mean,
so the fact that you
can become a family membership.
Right,
you can become a family membership means you just share with the other people. Yeah.
So, but if the point is that Costco is just always cheaper, at least if you're willing to wait for the sale, then there's no point in paying the membership for more than one of those. So I'm curious how many people are member.
They have a different product line. They have certain products which is only carried in certain stores, but not the other. So if you want the entire product space, then you want to have a different product. Yeah, that's something I was asking Lukas first.
Kind of I think the allocation of products is important here, because you can kind of like, we do have this perception, that for example, Whole Foods is expensive, right? But in the data, that seems to be not the case, because Whole Foods is expensive on the same things as Trader Joe's, but it's mostly because Whole Foods sells a very different set of things, right? Whole Foods sells high quality apples to high income people, and Trader Joe's sells medium quality apples to not high income people. And so that's kind of I think where it's important to think about kind of both the allocation of the consumption bundle and what you're buying and which products these stores are selling and how much you're searching in a combined way, and because there are these interactions.
Folks, very quickly, I'll stop recording, but I'm happy to stick around. Lukas, if you have time, we can also stick around for a couple of more questions.
I'm happy to stick around as long as there are questions.
It has been excellent so far. Let's keep doing it.